All right, perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Carini Maria Contreras Nunez, but you can please feel free to call me Carini. I am one of the co-chairs here for the Government Relations Committee for the Indiana ACAC. And alongside me as my fellow co-chair is Brandon Curry, who is hosting this meeting and doing all the techie stuff on the other end here. Additionally, we have several other committee members here today that I would really like to thank, because without our committee and all the work that we've collectively put together, a lot of the things that we're doing wouldn't be possible. So just a really big shout out to the Government Relations Committee. I'm so glad to work alongside all of you. So a couple of things, as Brandon mentioned before, there is that login sheet. It's a Google document that is here on the group chat. Please make sure that if you've not signed up, if you do not see your name on the Google Doc, that you add yourself to that. And if you were here for the last session in October, I highly recommend just going back into that Google Doc and checking off that you're here for this November session as well. As a reminder, for those of you that are doing the certificate program but were not able to attend this session today, this recording will be available afterwards. I will send it in a link in an email to all of the participants. So the recording will be available. This is our second session in this series of 4 total sessions, and I'm really excited to introduce David Hawkins. He is our Executive Director for Educational Content and Policy at NACAC, and he will be talking to us about, policy on a national level, so what NACAC stands for and the work that they're doing on that level. And then in about half an hour or so, I will be chatting about what we are prioritizing on a local level. So I'm going to turn this over to David Hawkins. David, please feel free to join in.
Thank you, Carini. Thank you, Brandon, and the Government Relations Committee for having me here today. If you'll bear with me for a second, I'm going to share my screen so that I can pull my presentation up. So here we go. All right. Going to slideshow mode here. Okay, can everyone see that? I can't really see anybody. So
yes.
Thank you, Carini. Okay, again, I'm David Hawkins. I just really quickly, before I start to talk to you about NACAC's policy, sort of core values and priorities, just a little background about myself. I am currently in my 21st year at NACAC, and my initial job when I was first hired way back in the year 2000, when you had to say the words "the year" before the actual year, I was hired as Director of Government Relations. So this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, and I am especially appreciative of those of you who are willing to step outside of your regular jobs and advocate and volunteer for this, because it is such an important thing to do. And as someone who has volunteered in other areas myself, I know how hard it can be to find the time to do these things. So I want to make sure to convey a special thank you as we start out to those of you who are doing this and who are willing to advocate on behalf of the profession and the students we serve. One more quick anecdote before I jump into the slideshow. My first day at NACAC is something that I often think about and want to talk to you a little bit about, because advocacy can be kind of intimidating. It can feel overwhelming. There's a lot of jargon in it. There's a lot of very deep sort of subject matter. But at its very core, it is really about articulating our own experiences and what they say about the world. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind all throughout your journey through advocacy. My first day at NACAC was kind of comical. I came into the office, and my boss at the time sat me down at my desk and said, "Well, here's your desk. I'll be back in a little while." And I sat there, and I sat there. And 5 minutes passed, a half hour passed, an hour. So I started to think, he's not coming back. And so what I started to do was that I started looking through the files to see what NACAC was all about. And I saw that there were a lot of letters that other organizations had sent around that we had signed on to, which is still something we do to this day. But I didn't see a lot of original work in those files that I was looking at. And I thought, NACAC needs to have its own brain about advocacy. And I felt like this is a really potentially important thing to think about right when I was starting out, because then in the ensuing 21 years, Everything I have learned about the policy priorities I'm going to talk to you about, I have learned from you all. And I'm not kidding about that. I have a certain amount of policy and process knowledge that I brought with me to this job, but the process of developing NACAC's core values and policy priorities has fundamentally come from the membership. I often tell people I don't jump unless NACAC members tell me to. And I'm actually quite serious about that. So everything I'm about to show you comes from you, comes from the members over all of these years. And it is really, I think you'll recognize the constructs as being very familiar in terms of the way we kind of see the world as we work with students who go from secondary through the transition to post-secondary education and beyond. So I'll start right into the core values. This is where kind of it all starts. I don't know how many of you know that NACAC was formed in 1937. So we've been around a little while. And the whole purpose of NACAC is to organize around a set of ethical principles. Now, for a long time, those ethical principles really were exclusive to higher education because NACAC used to only include post-secondary institutions for a long time. Then when we opened it up to secondary institutions, which admittedly was way before my time, so when I say we, I'm speaking in the royal sense of NACAC, our role expanded. And over the years, we've grown from just a small sort of handful of ethical practice concerns to having a whole document that contains all sorts of different standards for practice. As part of that ethical core, for a long time, we enforced the standards that were in our what used to be called Statement of Principles of Good Practice, which in 2017 was revised and changed to the Code of Ethics and Professional Practices, CEPP. Shortly after that, the Department of Justice came knocking and decided that NACAC's enforcement of our ethical code posed some antitrust risks. And that's a whole other presentation, so I won't go into it. I'll just tell you that the long and short of it is that we now, over the last couple of years, our leadership and our membership have decided rather than enforce these principles, we're going to move to best practice recommendations, but we're still going to keep this thing that we call now the Guide to Ethical Practice in College Admission. And if you've ever read this document, you know at the very beginning we have a set of core values. And the bullets on the left there are the core values that we articulate. And we will always be dedicated to these core values. And they're important for our advocacy because they really, I kind of want to emphasize going back all the way back to the first day on the job story, this is where all of our priorities emerge from. And as we go through the slideshow, you'll see how each priority sort of builds on these core values and extends out to more tangible policy priorities when we go through the process of evaluating legislation or thinking about what we want to advocate for. So the first one, education is pretty obvious. We're committed to education. But when you think about operationalizing these things, education is something that has sort of innate qualities to it. It is a good in and of itself. And that drives a lot of our thinking when we think about policy priorities. Is education something that should be purchased? Is it something that should be available to some but not others? Is it something that we think should have public support versus should it be a more individualized endeavor? So that's something that we keep front and center in all of our priorities. Access and equity. I think in order to sort of consider that education is our core priority, we have decided over the years and we've decided that we have to ensure that everybody has equal access to it. Because without equal access to education, then education in and of itself is not accessible to everyone and is not really a core value, but simply a value that is held somewhere, but maybe secondary to some other thing. So access and equity are kind of a really important complement to that first bullet and necessary for us to really fully realize what we're talking about there. As we look at the next two, professionalism and collegiality, those are really sort of internally facing values, so you don't see those come up as much in our external values or in our external policy priorities. But we do, I think, as you start to advocate, you understand how professionalism and collegiality start to play a role in what you actually do. One of the most important things you can do when you're talking to someone who is a representative or who is a policymaker is to be professional, is to know your profession. Because they know a lot of things about policy and about legislative process, but they know nothing about what we do for the most part. Collegiality is important because we ultimately have to work with other people in our profession, whether it's inside an institution or whether it's with other people who want access to government money or government processes. We have to be able to work with others. And in fact, there is often strength in numbers. So that does come in handy as we think about coalition building. Trust is really critical. And this is something that I often find myself talking about when we think about education, particularly when you think about higher education and some of the actors that tend to get into for-profit, the for-profit higher education space. Students trust, by and large, students trust education and educators. And so it's really incumbent on us as we think about our policy priorities to be able to espouse policies that do not abuse students' trust. And when you have a set of institutions that is acting in a predatory fashion, that is an abuse of that trust. So that, again, as we start going through some of the specific priorities, you'll see how these start to emerge in how we think about policy. And then finally, social responsibility. I think over the years of working with NACAC, I think I've come to the conclusion, to the realization, whatever, that we're only as strong as our most vulnerable member. And when you think about students, as a country, we are only as strong as the student who has the least opportunity. So we want to make sure that as part of all of our advocacy, that we think about everyone and their access to education. So how do these core values start to become translated into policy priorities? Well, this slide is an overview of what the subsequent slides will actually say, but I think it's helpful to sort of look at it and see that higher education as a public good is something that we've come to after years and years of experience, and particularly after this year with the pandemic, with the social justice concerns and unrest in this country, that we really have to think of higher education as something that is a public good. It confers benefits to everyone, not just the individual. We get better employment, which yields to better income, which yields to better health, better civic participation, better tax returns, just a more vibrant and healthy society. And this is something that we believe really flows directly out of our core values. The second piece here is that we emphasize equitable opportunity and access to post-secondary education. This is kind of the embodiment of the equity core value and the social responsibility core value. As we start thinking about areas of policy that we can affect, we know that within states and across the country, there is inequitable access to opportunity, to resources, to all sorts of different aspects of education. So NACAC ends up advocating for a lot of policies that attempt to restore, well, I don't know if restore is the right word, it's probably to bring equity to our educational processes and particularly to access to post-secondary education. Our third major policy bucket here is about protecting students' interests in the transition to college. Again, this stems directly from our ethical practice code and from our core value of trust. This is something that, again, students have a great deal of trust in what we do as educators, and to abuse that trust is to fail our students. The other thing that's kind of important to think about when it comes to NACAC, because NACAC is a little bit unusual in the education association space in that we don't represent a single profession of people like the School Counselors Association or the collegiate registrars and admission officers or financial aid administrators. We were formed around an idea. And part of that idea, part of that ethical core that we believe in is about, in some ways, considering the students' interests as a counterweight to our own individual and institutional interests. Because sometimes if you leave, let's just take for instance a higher education institution, if you leave an institution to its own self-interest, it may not always act in the student's self-interest. And I think we all know that from being around NACAC, and it applies to everyone. It's not just post-secondary institutions. So that's a third important policy bucket that we tend to operate out of. And then the fourth bucket, which has emerged more recently, and is, some people tend to think, well, this is less relevant on the state level, but it really isn't when you think about it. We promote global student mobility and cultural understanding. I think in this year, 2020, we've seen more than any, perhaps, the importance of international students to not only to the bottom line at institutions, which, of course, they're important in that respect. The financial, not financial aid advisors, sorry, the Foreign Student Advisors Association, NAFSA, estimates that international students bring $40 billion to the U.S. economy each year. That's a lot of money, but it also brings cultural understanding. And I think right now we are operating in a global society, and it's not going to change. We always have to consider local concerns, but global understanding is increasingly critical to our success as individuals, as institutions, as an association, and as a country. So that's where we come from. Those are our four big catch-all buckets. And pretty much you can fit any policy initiative into one of those four buckets. And I'll sort of walk through some of what we're doing these days to give you a sense of where the action is now. This report that I'm showing up on the screen now, the Roadmap for Change, emerged directly from our ad hoc committee on leadership in college admission, which we convened late last year and into this year. And while the committee's full report was more focused on NACAC itself, there was this policy takeaway that we published that's available on our website that really has sort of expands a little bit on this higher ed as a public good idea. And the general, the six sort of principles are there underneath, and I won't necessarily read through all of those. But the idea is that there are specific policy mechanisms that we can employ to help make higher education a public good. Over the last 30, 40 years or so since the Higher Education Act was first passed and things like the Pell Grant were established and the student loan programs were established, we've moved from a scenario where the Pell Grant was supposed to be able to pay for tuition and fees at a four-year college for someone in need. Nowadays, it covers less than 20%. If that, at a public institution. Of course, it's going to depend on the institution. In some private institutions, it gets down into the single digits in terms of how much it covers. At the same time, we have ballooned outward on the amount of student loans that people take out to go to college. The federal student loan volume has increased by 300% over the last 30 years. So the idea, as we've looked back on this year, as we've looked back at this committee report, with the pandemic, we have exposed all of the inequities in our system. We've exposed all the financial vulnerability. We've exposed the challenges related to student debt. And this committee felt like it was really important for NACAC to start articulating, you know what, we need to start thinking about this again. We need to think about states funding higher education fully so that you can afford to go to a state institution using a Pell Grant. And no loans. If that's what you need, then that's what we should do. We fundamentally think that we should take the burden off of the individual students and spread it out and move it back to sort of reflect the fact that when you give a student a post-secondary education, you're giving something to the entire country. So we all benefit from it. We can all chip in for it. So that's sort of a big high level framework that we're going to start employing over the coming years to base our policy positions out of. And it might lead to some new positions. We have a lot of discussions forthcoming with members and leaders where we'll try to flesh these out. But just wanted to put that up as our very first sort of offering and something you can certainly take a look at. It's not a very long report. It's maybe 6 or 7 pages. So something that we're going to be operating out of from here on out. The second bucket that we look at really kind of reflects what we do and know professionally. This is about promoting equitable college access policies, and this is a little bit of a where we've been so far sort of look at our advocacy. If you think about the students' progress from secondary into post-secondary institution, you can see in these bullets, one, they need equitable access to funding for education and access to college preparatory curriculum. We know that a lot of students have very limited access to courses that will help them to prepare for college. We know just from the fact that we work in those schools and that when we're admission officers, we see the inequities on the transcripts. We see what students do and don't have access to. So we need that to be more equitable. We also need students to have access to school counselors and college advising. I'm going to flip forward here and show you a map of Indiana that has, this is a district level analysis of student to counselor ratios. Our research team put this together last year using federal Department of Education data. And you can see the number of school districts that have 500 or more students per counselor is pretty numerous there. And it's pretty large in Indiana there. And the number of green districts that are more closer to the 250 to 1 recommended ratio are quite few and far between. So that's available at this website down at the bottom, and we have all the other states up there as well. So if you want to take a look at others to see what that looks like. But bottom line is we know, you have to have access to college preparatory curriculum. You have to have access to college advising. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but as a sort of a three-legged stool, you need access to money to go to college. And so again, I talk about state funding for higher ed. States have, even though the dollar amounts have gone up, the per student spending has gone down, and the fact that students now have to take out more loans reflects the diminishing value of the need-based financial aid, both at the state and federal level. So we've for a very long time believed that you need to invest in all three of those things in order for students to be able to make a successful transition from K-12 to post-secondary education. One other issue that we've advocated for a long time is undocumented students' access to in-state tuition and federal financial aid. I think with the Biden administration coming in, we will see a reemergence of DACA in some form. And we will see potentially a reintroduction of the DREAM Act in Congress, which would provide undocumented students with access to in-state tuition and federal student aid. NACAC has worked for as long as I've been here and even longer on this issue, and it is so disheartening to see the tens of thousands of students who graduate from high school every year who are undocumented, who are as American as you and me, and who have done everything that we've asked of them. For them to hit such a high wall right there at graduation is a real shame, and we just hope that we can move that along in this new Congress. Our third major sort of policy priority area is this protection of students' interests. And primarily this has to do with predatory for-profit colleges that go out and recruit students, particularly students who are eligible for federal financial aid, which is disappointing because they're the very same students we're trying to help serve as we go through as we go through the transition from K-12 to higher ed. I'm sorry, I got a little distracted. There may be some questions. I will happily address those. I can't see them very well with my screen on slideshow, but I'll come back to your questions, I promise, if they're out there. So apologies for that. But I put a little graphic up here. The bullets, first of all, sort of walk you through what we think we ought to do. First, we need to stop predatory colleges from the kinds of misleading and high pressure sales tactics that they expose students to, because ultimately they try to push these students in to capture their student loan money. And then once the students are in, they don't really get anything for the value in a lot of cases, in the predatory college cases. And then at the very end, they're left with very little in terms of a degree or job prospects, yet they have tens of thousands of dollars of student loan debt. And by and large, these institutions are way more expensive than nonprofit institutions are, particularly comparable programs. We also want to stop incentivizing the predatory colleges with federal and state aid. We think that the bar ought to be pretty high to be able to benefit from federal and state aid, and that there are a lot of predatory colleges that aren't really fitting that bill. And then finally, we do a lot of work on trying to remedy students who have been defrauded by these institutions, to help them get rid of their student loan debt and maybe to have it forgiven by the federal government, particularly if a college has been found to have engaged in fraud. But you can kind of see this little graphic that I put over here. This is an actual graphic from an actual recruitment manual at a for-profit college. The Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee conducted a comprehensive investigation in 2012. And they put forward information that would just make your socks roll. It's really shocking, some of the things that they found. But the recruitment, the recruitment evidence that they put forward was really quite disturbing. You can see it says it is all about uncovering their pain and fears. Once they are reminded of how bad things are, this will create a sense of urgency to make this change. And what that really kind of shows you is they're trying to put people in a state of pain and fear, and then they use high pressure sales tactics. The most common of which is to create a sense of urgency. The classes are filling up. If you don't act today, you might not be able to enroll. Well, these are online classes. They can enroll pretty much any time, and there's pretty much no capacity limits at these schools. And so they go through and they do a lot of, or have done a lot of nefarious things. And that's just, again, I go back to our core values. We're about education, we're about trust, and we're about equity and access. And none of those things are reflected in approaches like this. So that's something that we really feel strongly about, and that we have spent a lot of time on here at NACAC. Needless to say, it also aligns quite nicely with our ethical principles, which really try to prevent that kind of behavior. Finally, I'll note that we have more recently, and I'd say within the last decade or so, started to advocate for more international policies and policies that would affect the movement of international students. Certainly, we have had concerns in the past about how institutions recruit international students. We don't want to subject them to the kinds of high pressure tactics that we see in the for-profit sector. Globally, K-12 education is considered a fundamental human right. We would like to expand that to post-secondary education and start to think about that in the U.S. Start to frame our policy in the U.S. both with regard to our domestic students and to international students, to see education as a public fundamental good. And then finally, we look at U.S. policy issues that are relevant to the international community. I think this past administration has been difficult for us because a lot of what it has done has helped to slow the entry of students into this country. And it has started to have a negative effect. Now, you can't dismiss the effects of the pandemic, but when you think of things like the travel bans, you think of tightening visa eligibility criteria to exclude a lot more people than we used to. There was a change where students had to put their social media information so that visa officers could review their social media. All of these things, when you combine them together, start to paint a picture of the U.S. as a less than welcoming place. And this is something that we're concerned about. And this has real dollars and cents ramifications for our colleges, not to mention the public diplomacy effects and the effects on just limiting our own view of the world, which again is not something that I think is in our best interest in the long term. So that's kind of an overview of all of our priorities. It's very condensed. Obviously, I know I ran through a lot of that very quickly. The last thing I'll say is that I will always welcome you to please email me if you have questions, if I can be of any assistance to you. And also, if you're not on following the NACAC Wonk on Twitter, that is where we post an awful lot of news and updates about what we're doing. And I think it gives you a pretty good sense of kind of where we are on a day-to-day basis. So I hope that was at least a complete overview, even if it was a little fast. I'm going to stop sharing now and go back.
David, I think you did a wonderful job, and I wanted to thank you so much. Yeah.
Great. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, terrific.
I'm going to transition really briefly and just go over our survey results. If any of you have any questions for David, please add them to the chat now as I'm chatting. And after I conclude my survey analysis, then we'll ask David the hard questions. We'll get to the root of the matter. I will begin sharing my PowerPoint presentation here. Here we go. All right, can you all see that in full screen? All good, perfect, thank you. So one of the things that Brandon and I have done over the past several months as we've been restructuring and reorganizing our committee is also trying to identify and determine what are the key policy priorities that our constituents have? Because we can't do, our job right as co-chairs of this committee and as members of this committee if we don't know what you want us to advocate for on your behalf and what you want us to prioritize. There's a lot of different things that we could do, but we really want to make sure that we allocate our resources and our time as wisely and as efficiently as possible, especially because right now we're a relatively small committee that's growing. So if you are interested in joining our committee, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. We are always happy to have more hands on deck. But earlier this fall, Brandon and I sent out a government relations climate survey to answer two key questions. And the first question is, what is the best way to communicate with our constituents? We just want to make sure that we're able to provide the information that you need when you need it at a relatively consistent period of time. And then the second question that we really wanted to ask is that main question of how should we prioritize and allocate our resources as we are considering all the different things that we could be advocating for. Overall, with our responses, we had 217 total survey responses. Some of them were incomplete. So we did not consider those that were complete between 10 and 14%. We did end up considering those that were complete between 40 and 80% of a progression mark. And the reason is because many of the questions towards the end were questions that were, are you interested in participating in our committee? How should we contact you? For example, put in your email here. So those questions, we considered them as null responses. Basically, the participants just omitted a response, and that really did not affect that main question of what should we advocate for and how should we communicate with people, which were those two main questions that we wanted to answer throughout this survey. So for us, considering these questions with null responses did not affect our data analysis in any way whatsoever. As a result, we considered a total of 166 responses from our survey. This is where our responses came from. I think someone was either traveling to Portland or maybe they were using a VPN, like a virtual private network of sorts. So that's how we got that person out in Portland. And I think that person that was doing it from Columbus, Ohio was probably Vanessa Gibson. So shout out to Vanessa. But this is where they were coming from across the continental US. And I don't know if you can see this map very well, but this is where they're coming from in Indiana. And upon further analysis, so what I did was I reversed IP addressed everybody. So that metadata analysis, everyone, just so you know, I reversed IP addressed everyone and plotted all of your locations on Google Maps. And here's some of the key takeaways that I think we should remember as we're looking at this data set and as we're considering, future surveys. So the first thing is that this is a convenience sample, and my professor, my methods professor, Dr. Potacek, would be very proud of me right now for remembering all of these things. So thank you, Dr. Potacek. But what that means is that we really need to consider future surveys to be much more intentional on capturing underrepresented groups in the survey. If you just look at the map all on its own, you can tell that the majority of people were kind of cloistered in and around Indianapolis, in and around Gary, which is our larger cities. And we really need much more larger and broader representation of the entire state of Indiana. So we really need to consider regional diversity. We also need to consider more public school counselors. When I was looking at a lot of the emails from these survey participants, most of them were private emails. So something else to really consider is broadening that diversity and bringing in more public school counselors. Additionally, a lot of the members are people that I may have known that I knew already. So they tended to have higher levels of professional experience and also were members that had more engagement in an ACAC. And we know that younger members, those newer to the professions, often feel discouraged and don't want to continue in the profession because they don't really see what they can do in the full capacity and realm of our professional scope. So definitely making sure that we capture those perspectives as well would be important if we're really thinking holistically about our profession and encouraging younger members and younger participants to be much more engaged. But these are just some really key things to be aware of as we are looking at these numbers now, and as we're considering how to improve our methodology for future surveys, specifically for this committee, right? So With that, with those caveats in place, let's move forward. So that first key question, how should we communicate? We asked our members to rank in order of preference, and we did ranking very strategically, and that'll come into play for the second portion of this conversation. We asked them, how should we communicate with you? Please rank your preferences. So in first place, the majority of recipients wanted us to communicate with them through our INACAC newsletter. So when we send those out, also include just a quick little GRC blurb. And another thing that we noticed was that social media was something that you all wanted us to do. And as a committee, it's something that we have not historically done. So that's one of the things that we're definitely looking to expand into. And when we look at social media, the majority of people want us to interact with you all through Facebook. We have an INACAC Facebook account. I've just recently found out I'm not even on it. So that should tell you something. And one of the ways that we're thinking is, should we post things on the INACAC Facebook page, or should we create our own government relations Facebook page? Would that be too much? Would that take too much space in the INACAC specific Facebook page, right? So it's a big question of, how do we want to use social media? How do we want to share this information on Facebook in particular? And it's something that we're going to be exploring as a committee moving forward. So please stay tuned with us, because it is something that we plan on doing. There are other things that were suggested. So teleconferencing or webinars, which we are doing now. So this is one of our webinars from our AWS certificate series. But Brandon and I have also talked about perhaps doing a webinar in the spring during Indiana's session to kind of inform you all and let you know what's going on, what are the bills that are being proposed, how are they passing through our legislative houses and their respective committees. So that could be something else that Brandon and I consider doing and bringing in as well. And then staff updates, I'm assuming that they meant like turnover within the committee, because we have had some changes in the committee. So perhaps a webinar introducing you to, our co-chairs, Brandon and myself, and then also our current committee members as well. Monthly or a biweekly email would be fine. So some have also asked for emails as a preferred method of communication because they're not on social media. We're not 100% sure about how we feel doing individual emails. We don't want to flood your inboxes. So we're probably going to stick to the newsletter, maybe making updates on our website, and then also using social media and incorporating that into our communication strategy. Moving on to part 2 of this conversation is we asked our constituents to rank in order of preference the issues that they would like for us to prioritize. And this was especially important that we used ranking here. And I will explain why as we go through these next couple of slides. So when we asked about policy priorities, the ones that we asked for were counselor to student ratio, K through 12 curriculum, equity in education, expanding need-based assistance, increasing student protections, undocumented students in DACA, and then other was another category that we selected to give individuals the options to select other considerations. Most people chose from these 6 selected. The other category was not really used. It was left in seventh place for the majority of individuals. But if we look at just the first place ranking, you get the sense that student to counselor ratios is number 1 and that all the other ones are kind of roughly in the same place. I'm really thankful that we chose the ranking method, because when you look at the mean distribution, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about this, you clearly see that our top 3 in order of prioritization, because they're the ones that are closest to 1, are equity in education, student to counselor ratio, then K through 12 curriculum. And then after that, we have expanding need-based assistance, undocumented students in DACA, and then increasing student protections. Now, you might see a discrepancy here between what was placed in first place and that mean distribution. And all the data people, just wait with me, hold on to me, I've got you. I've got a chart that's gonna explain all of this, so don't feel overwhelmed. This chart, I think, does a really good job explaining how we get from that first place iteration to a mean distribution that says something totally different. Don't become overwhelmed. I want you to look first down here on the x-axis where you see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each of these numbers and corresponding lines let you know where each of these priorities was ranked in order of prioritization and preference. And as you're looking through this, you can tell and you can see how that standard, how that deviation occurred, how that mean deviation occurred, and how we got to those numbers of prioritization. So for example, here on that first rank, everything seems kind of clustered together with the exception of student to faculty ratios. But as you move into the second and third rank, you start to see those discrepancies broaden. And you start to see the prioritization of that K through 12 curriculum and equity in education, which maintains a consistent kind of position throughout the entirety of the chart. It's not, for example, like increasing student protections, where it starts off relatively high with all of the other policies that we might want to consider. Eventually it dips down pretty low, and then it skyrockets when it gets to being ranked 5th and 6th. And the same goes with undocumented students and DACA. So this really tells a story of how you get from, you know, everything seeming like it's relatively important with that first place position, all the way through that distinction in prioritization based on the distribution of the mean. Any questions? I'm not a mathematician or a statistician by any stretch of the imagination, so don't ask me. I'll send you over to Professor Potacek. But just to reiterate, in first place right now, we have equity in education as our legislative priority, then student to counselor ratios, and then K through 12 curriculum and preparation for post-secondary opportunities. So that doesn't mean that we won't be prioritizing all of the other categories. It just means that if we have to allocate our time to, for example, a bill in equity in education over a bill that pertains to increasing student protections, that's just what we're going to have to do, because we are, like I said, a small committee. So if you do want to join us, you're more than welcome to. And last but not least, wanted to talk about our involvement in our Advocacy Day. Of all the survey recipients, 91 of you said that you would be interested in joining us for a virtual state advocacy day, which is really exciting. We will be planning that in December, so we'll get more information to you as soon as the legislative session for Indiana is announced. We'll get more information, don't worry. And then we also have a virtual advocacy day happening in March. If I'm not mistaken, it's March 8th and 9th, right, David? Yeah, so we just got an email about that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, David, before we wrap this up?
Yes, I'm sorry. I sometimes have to search for the cursor to get to the mute button. I apologize.
No worries, no worries.
Yeah, you know, actually, all I will say is that is still in development. We will get back to you with more details, but we absolutely are going to do something, and hopefully we'll be able to expand it so that more people can participate.
Awesome, thank you. So yeah, stay tuned from your local advocacy government relations committee, and then also the National Government Relations Committee. And this is it. This is what I have for you all. These are our top policy priorities and the type of communication that you can expect from us moving forward. Now this is time for open discussion. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have. We are more than happy to answer those questions on a local or a national level.
Karini, I will note that I just put a response to AJ's question in the chat about Pell data. Certainly, we can happy to talk about that more, but I think that link will take you to some good information about, you know, where we stand with how much of a tuition and fee sort of percent a Pell grant would comprise these days.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, you can feel free to chat about that. Actually, I'm a little bit interested. That's a good question, AJ.
Yeah, you know, the main thing I'll say is that back when Lyndon Johnson, who was president in the 60s, decided to, advocated for the Higher Education Act and Congress passed it, his vision really, and the vision of Congress, was that a 4-year public education should be within reach for anyone who wanted to go, and that the financial barrier should not be the obstacle, right? So the Pell Grant, as it was originally envisioned, was to cover the entirety of tuition and fees at a public 4-year college. Needless to say, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, that the purchasing power of the Pell Grant has eroded significantly as student loans have become the primary vehicle for people to afford college. And that's, you know, but there's a ton of debate in Washington. We will probably never solve the debate about why college prices are going up. We firmly believe, based on research, that it's the dwindling state support for public higher ed and the reliance on loans that has allowed the market to sort of balloon outward, and that costs are increasingly shifted to the institution themselves, which then gets passed on to the students.
Do you see that shifting? I know this isn't part of the conversation, but I am actually really curious. Do you see that shifting in the upcoming, I don't know, I would say 5 years? We have that cliff in 2025. We are in the middle of a pandemic right now where a lot of people are losing their jobs. Do you see that changing or in any way?
That I do. It is going to be a very difficult haul, and I'll tell you why. Number one, the reason I do see it changing is because even the Biden, the fledgling Biden administration that is preparing to take office in January is talking about things like doubling the Pell Grant, which would be a pretty significant change. They're also talking about student loan forgiveness and efforts to try to bring back the student loan sort of program to where it's really more for people who can afford to take out a loan but don't, but might just need it to fill the gap, versus the primary vehicle for everyone who goes to college, right? So there's a lot of will. There are a lot of groups like NACAC and others around DC that want to see that happen very badly. What's going to make it very difficult is that state and federal governments are suffering from this pandemic. Tax revenues are there's going to be demands everywhere: public health, housing, you name it. It's going to be difficult. But my sense is, and this goes back to our roadmap report, if there is the political will from the people, these things can happen. If we put our minds to it as a country, we can make these things happen. So I have some hope and encouragement that the direction might actually shift a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think it's really in the best interest of, of everyone. Higher education, as you were saying, is a public good. And it really is in the best interest of our entire society and social structure. At any rate, if there are no further questions, I don't want to keep you all here for far too long. Again, I really would like to thank David Hawkins. It's such a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to our next session with you in December. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, David will be joining us again to talk about different ways that we can advocate and hopefully get you all prepared and ready for our spring session, for our Indiana spring legislative session. So this is going to be really great, and we're really thankful to have you here, David. So thank you. A couple more housekeeping things I don't want anyone to forget. Sign-in sheet. If you've not signed in, please make sure that you do so. We will be tracking your attendance for degree progression. So please make sure that you sign in if you have not done so yet. For those of you that are watching this recording, in order to be considered for the certificate, please make sure that you send us a brief synopsis to Vanessa Gibson. Her email will be included in the email that I sent out after this presentation with the recording link. So just make sure you send her a brief synopsis of what we covered here and what you've learned so that you can be eligible for that certificate. And then last but not least, again, I just want to thank Brandon, my co-chair, and my GRC committee. Thank you so much for being here and for working together on this wonderful project and making sure that we do the best for our constituents and for our students.
Yeah, and by the way, I want everyone to know that Karini did such a good job with that presentation and going through all that data. I mean, it's so great to see the progress that GRC is making, and Karini's a big part of that. And thank you again to David for being part of this. I mean, I think that in addition to what's happening locally, statewide, nationally, there is just a groundswell movement to make sure that we are making education more equitable, accessible for all populations. And so, yeah, I'm excited to see what's going to happen in the future. Make sure that everybody who is on this today or is watching afterward is in the December session as well.
Yes, for sure. And don't forget about that December session. That'll be the third session. But thank you all so much for being here. I hope you've enjoyed your time and take care. Bye.